The middle class were invented to give the poor hope, the poor to make the rich feel special, the rich to humble the middle class. Mokokoma Mokonowana.
The feudal model and the five-class classical model of how social hierarchies are displayed are the conventional ways people think societies such as modern America are constructed. However, that analysis is deeply flawed for a number of reasons. In the rest of this video, I'm going to break down the actual class structure, at least in my opinion, from my analysis of American economics, politics, and sociology, how it actually works, how it greatly differs from class systems in other parts of the world, historical class systems, and general misconceptions about social class in the United States. The thing to note on the American model is the degree of competition within the elites and those rising up, which is not seen in other countries where the status of the elites is more stable and monopolistic in nature. This is more a theory, not a hard fact on class structures. This is just my analysis through observation and studying history and economics. Social pyramids across societies historically differ in significant ways and have changed greatly over time. So the social hierarchy in the United States in the 1950s looked a lot different than in 2020 and will look a lot different in the 2007 ES. Let's start with the American class hierarchy, which was probably similar in English colonial societies such as Canada and Australia. However, in the latter, it's probably less mobile. The American class hierarchy is not a single pyramid. It's more like two diverging paths. The bottom is the same, but the further you move up, the more diversion there is. In times of social cohesion, the two pyramids that create the elite and the counter elite will be closer together, if not outright merged like they were right after World War II. But in times that are more politically tense or there is more scarcity for a higher standard of living, it widens because there is less to go around in terms of social status and modern privileges than there was in the past. Let's start from the bottom and work up from there. The bottom is the underclass, which is really people who are dependent on the state and work outside the formal economy. These are the people who live on social welfare and commit a disproportionate amount of crime. They tend to be in remote rural areas or inner cities. The next level is the working class or the precariat class. Now, these are people who work, they make enough money to basically keep themselves alive, maybe with the help of debt, but don't really have enough left over to save or to get ahead. You can advance out of this. And that's the thing. Like if there's a gap, it means that the wider the gap between each tier, means the more difficult it is to advance. So as you see, there's a sizable gap between the underclass and the working class due to negative incentives in the social welfare system and poor habits developed from growing up in the underclass culture. The working class can move up if they're competent at their job or get an education that can earn them more money. The next level is the middle class or the clerical class. These are people who do corporate administration type jobs or things that keep the trains running on time and the lights on in society. These range from bureaucratic office jobs to truck drivers to those who do a lot of other things. But the thing in common is that they are employees or independent contractors that aren't really true businesses. They have some disposable income, but not enough to really ever make a material dent to get out of working their boring 9-to-5 job. These people, this tier tends to be the least political also in American society. The next level is where it starts to split because you can either choose to align with the establishment elite or go your own way and protest against the established elite. We're going to work top down. The establishment elite are basically the people who have institutional control and privilege in society. These could be old money, the people who run major corporations. These are the top ranking officials in government and politicians in the inner party, which is the faction within American politics that has dominant cultural institutional control. They are also anybody who's gotten wealthy through the establishment or being supported by it. The thing in common with them all is that they have been successful through either being entitled to that through class inheritance or institutional inheritance through being related to powerful families in the past, or they got there through their relationships with these people, being beholden to their interests and then adopting their values and becoming part of the pie. That's why you see, for example, that these people all tend to share the same cultural values, even if they come from technically different backgrounds, because it's a go along to get along type culture. Usually, you have to be in the establishment elite. You got to have gone to the right universities or have the right social circles or be a talent that is recognized early by this group and trained by them, like a lot of celebrities are. The next tier below that is call them the Ivy League class. What differs the Ivy League class from the establishment elites is that the Ivy League class still has to work for a living, while the establishment elite do not. You can have people of higher incomes in the Ivy League class than the establishment elite, but the establishment elite either have enough generational wealth or institutional credibility. They don't need to work constantly to maintain their wealth and lifestyle. That's what differentiates the elites from the classes in the American class hierarchy. Both the elite and the counter elite have enough money that they do not have to work and do not experience lack. If you are somebody super frugal and saved $1 million and retires, but you still have to live off of $40,000 a year, which is your 4% interest, and budget on that, you're not elite. You're just somebody who saved a lot and fortunately was able to retire and keep their costs down. The true elites are people who can live the lavish lifestyles of the wealthiest suburbs of America and not have to work. Independently wealthy, whether through their own means or through connections. Establishment is through connections and playing the game of the people who the political class want you to. It's part of the reason why a lot of people adopt a lot of the same social views. It's a go along to get along game. Whereas the Ivy League class are people who are working to become part of the establishment elite. A lot of them won't ever make it there. But these people went to Ivy League universities. They tend to be very intelligent, but they also tend to be very conforming. They want to be part of the establishment elite. These are high-level corporate executives, a lot of lawyers, a lot of doctors, academics at elite universities. These people will make well over $100,000 a year, and they feel like they are on their way to becoming the establishment elite. Hit this group the hardest because they're W-2 employees and have high income. So they don't really have the advantages of business owners on the tax side. And they also have the high expectations of living a certain lifestyle. So they can't really break through to save enough to become the establishment elite. It takes a lot more money to live a $200,000 a year lifestyle or $400,000 a year lifestyle without having to work. If you have a 4% interest rate, that's the $10 million you need in assets. And it's very difficult to save $10 million before you turn 70 on a $250,000 a year job. There are ways you can do it, and then you can break into the establishment elite, or your salary goes high enough by just moving up the pyramid. But this is extremely competitive. The Ivy League class is an accomplishment itself because less than 1% of college students can get into the Ivy League or similar prestigious university. These people differentiate themselves through their quality of education and their ability to buy into the establishment elite. They have a very high work ethic, but maybe not necessarily a high level of critical thinking, or even if they do, a willingness to challenge the system or take risks. The left is the safer path. The right side is the riskier path. The institutional professional class is the next level below the Ivy League class. Did not go to Ivy League institutions and lack the social connections of the Ivy League class, but they're still at a higher level than the middle class. This is probably the $100,000 to $200,000 a year corporate professional job. The Ivy League classes are probably in income terms $200,000, $200,000 to $500,000 a year managerial jobs, or maybe even a little higher than that nowadays. These are not solely determined on income, but I'm using that to help paint a picture. The institutional professional class's job is to provide the professional services needed for their establishment elite and Ivy League class clients. That's really their role, to help manage the middle and clerical classes. The other side is the more independent, rebellious path that leads the counter elite. You have the independent professional class. These are people who did not really go through the traditional path. Like, they didn't go to the prestigious universities. Some may have not even gone to college, but they've managed to build a nice niche. A lot of these people are in emerging industries. The left side is more people who work at big corporations and have the resumes and the willingness to conform to fit into those. Right column are more people who figure out a way to make themselves get ahead anyway. These people can be business owners who are emerging on their way to success. They make their income similar to the institution professional class, but they do it as an independent business owner or contractor. People work for small businesses providing a valuable service. They are people who are not aligned with the institutions and were either excluded for certain reasons or chose a different path. These are mostly emerging entrepreneurs. I think the differentiation for class is not necessarily how much money you make. It's more how you make your money and how much you have left over. So I base it basically on how much money you have left over after expenses. And the left and the right is really just how tied you are to the established social order and political, cultural elite for your livelihood. For the people on the left side of this pyramid are more tied to them. The people on the right are more anti-fragile. And the next level is successful business owners, like people who have been able to build a business that is self-sustaining to the point that they'll never have to go back into the institutional ladder. And they can make the same income level as the Ivy League class without having to go up the corporate ladder. That's what I would put in the successful business owners category. Then the counter elite are people who've reached the same level of establishment wealth without being part of their social circle for various reasons. Maybe they just didn't get along with them or didn't share the same values. Like, a lot of immigrant families who become wealthy end up in the counter elite for this reason. Also, it could just be a cultural or political difference. Historically, you would see establishment and counter elites on both sides of the political aisle. The election of 2016 has shifted the political dynamic, with the institutional wing now being more left and the counter elite being more right. That has rarely been the case in American history. You've had people on both sides of the political aisle in each category, and still do. The increase in polarization is a lot of it. If you do something in the establishment elite that is not well regarded, it makes you a pariah or disliked, like being canceled. You can get kicked out and still have your wealth and power. You still have your financial wealth and may not have to work anymore. You're still in the elite, but you've become the counter elite. The main difference in the establishment elite and the counter elite The establishment elite disproportionate influence in terms of political and social power outside of just purely money, whereas the counter elite really only has money and lacks institutional and cultural power. The internet has changed that, as the counter elite can do independent platforms that are separate from the establishment elite. However, if somebody becomes successful enough, they integrate into the establishment elite. Every major corporation and university going woke is because that's what the establishment elite wants them to do. It's a signal that I'm part of the establishment elite or on the institutional ladder. That's what all of this is about. In the olden days, maybe that was converting to Protestantism. Nowadays, it can mean different things in different eras, but there are certain signals that say I'm either part of the institutional pyramid or the rebellious pyramid. Major changes in the political and social culture in American history happen when the counter elite gathers enough resources and unites the lower parts of the pyramid to knock off the establishment elite and become the new counter elite. If they fail, then there's usually significant legal, political, and financial consequences to that failure. But when you have a real major change in a country's society and culture that has this type of hierarchy, it's when the counter elite knocks off the establishment elite. This one has gone on so long. I was originally going to do these in a single video, but instead, I'm just going to do a separate video for each one of these class hierarchies because there's a lot to this. But let me know if you have any questions. Again, this is me trying to put in something that I see in the world via intuition into a readable chart. What are your thoughts on the American class hierarchy? Am I right that it's really just a battle between those who are on the establishment ladder versus the counter elite ladder, and the differentiator is not necessarily your education and your income, but more of how you make your money, how much you have left over, and what kind of freedom you have because of that? Notice another thing. I did not mention anything on race or ethnicity or religion or gender because those don't really matter on this. All of those are used as weapons for the establishment elite and the counter elite to fight each other. And that's the whole point I'm trying to get at. Our modern political polarization is really just the counter elite and the establishment elite fighting over who gets to control the country. The establishment elite feels at risk that their position is not as secure as it used to be. And so a lot of it is lashing out. If people understood that this is the way the system works, there would be a lot less division. The goal of a lot of these controversial issues to maintain division, economic balance, is to get the bottom tiers to fight against each other so they don't realize they are being played by both the establishment elite and the counter elite. I call it the European class hierarchy, but this generally applies to developed old world countries. That would also probably include Japan and possibly Canada. Canada is probably a hybrid between this and the American class hierarchy. Whereas Australia and New Zealand are probably closer to the American class hierarchy model. People ask me about where the UK fits in this because it has some elements of the American class hierarchy and it's kind of the root of modern American culture to a certain extent, and parts of the European hierarchy. But at this point, especially in the post-Clement Attlee development of the welfare state and the surrender of their empire, the UK is definitely more, I would consider, in the European class hierarchy. There are some people in the City of London and in finance who have been able to show social mobility and move from more humble backgrounds to prosperity, but they are kind of more the exceptions that prove the rule. The class system in the UK is just as rigid, if not more rigid, than many parts of the continent. Europe, this really kind of describes Europe, where everybody thinks Europe's the most egalitarian place in the world. They don't have a restrictive class structure. that was all the old days before the revolutions and the world wars. Well, no. But really what the European elites did, starting with Otto von Bismarck, who was hardly a left-wing radical. He was known for being a conservative, but he was the one who brought in the German welfare state and was the first European power to really give generous social programs. What they did is that they were using the wealth and prosperity they gained from empire and economic advancement to buy off their lower classes and make them content enough not to challenge the established order. And this expanded after the Second World War, where the social welfare state expanded even more. And they did this along with having some of the steepest and highest tax rates in the world on income to basically create one giant lower middle class. The old money continues to really rule things behind the scenes. There's really three main tiers, and I size these buckets accordingly based on proportionate to how much of a size they are, except for the circles. I just had to make them a minimum size to fit the words in. The underclass living off the state at the bottom. Europe has a generous social welfare system, and some people just can't produce enough basic work to cover themselves, or immigrants who are unable to assimilate. The unemployment rates are higher in these countries due to their priorities for social stability or economic growth. And they tend to have tough hiring and firing laws, which leads some people to not be able to participate. So they live off the generosity of the state. They're still a pretty small number. The vast majority of Europe, I would put in the lower middle class. And what I mean by the lower middle class is that they make enough money to be comfortable and survive, but they are not really able to get ahead financially in any meaningful sort of way in terms of through assets or being able to build businesses independent of the corporate and governments that hire these class of people. European GDP per capita in most countries is less than half that of the average American nowadays. If you met Europeans who live in Europe, outside of those who are well-to-do or live in well-run countries such as Switzerland, you would be surprised how low their living standard is compared to the typical suburban American. You don't see any of these people driving big SUVs or pickup trucks in Europe. A lot of people still hang dry their clothes, live in small apartments, and they don't have a lot of the creature comforts that we take for granted here in American suburbia. Some people like that, but that's the cost of having everybody at a similar level and a single lower middle class. The high taxes and the generous welfare state really disincentivizes people to climb up, and also disincentivizes savings. According to Credit Suisse, the median Chinese citizen has more savings than the median European, even though the Chinese income is about a fourth of that of Western Europe. The reason for that is because of things such as the government paying for healthcare, education, and retirement means that European consumers really have less propensity or need to save, or at least they feel that way. The next level above that is the managerial class. The managerial class will have higher incomes than the lower middle class, but not high enough that their lifestyle is completely disconnected from the vast majority of Europeans. Not enough that they can just retire at 40 and chill out. These are the people who are higher level government bureaucrats or executives at European multinational corporations. And then the only way any of these people in this box can move up beyond the lower middle class box is through political action and running for office. Like similar old world regimes in the feudal system, the only way to move up was through political revolution and violence. That's why the feudal system failed because there was no room for social mobility. The old money in Europe doesn't like social mobility. They never have and they never will. But at the same time, they know if they mismanage things bad enough, they will risk being overthrown by revolution, like what happened in the 18th and 19th centuries. The way that they've adjusted for that is to, at least on paper, cater to the egalitarian impulse that is common in Western Europe. I used to not understand why Europe cared so much more about social stability and the tall poppy syndrome than America did. There was their history of violence through war and revolution that took a lot of the risk taking capacity out of the region. Also, a lot of the more enterprising people moved to the Americas, and a lot of this welfare state was developed as an enticement to prevent their population from moving to America. Instead of getting welfare, they had either free lands, the Homestead Act, or just more economic opportunity due to the dynamic economic growth going on in America. The other thing that really drives this is because they know inherently that their systems are not fair, whether in the feudal class or ancien regime. There's always some old money elites, and the politicians that they supported or were part of, there's no chance, no matter how hard they worked. And even some of the wealthy merchants of the time who maybe had as much cash as the nobility would never have the same social status. So they're like, wait, oh, we want to get rid of all of that, because if these people don't deserve to be above us, why does anybody deserve to live above the mass? And so I think that's where a lot of that attitude came from, was just seeing these people who, through birth and entitlement, had been ruling over them for centuries, be put in their place. The remaining old money has adapted to that. They like the old money likes this arrangement too, because the high progressive taxes limit competition. Like Europe's economic system of high taxes and more difficulties in terms of barriers to entry for entrepreneurship and business competition favors established interests, keeping their established interests. And the other also prevents you from challenging the existing wealthy's status through barging in with new money. And that is why they like this system the way it is. It prevents new people from going in. It also takes the social scrutiny off of them. And that's why a lot of these European income inequality statistics are so warped, because a lot of these old money people earn their money well before the era of progressive taxation and high inheritance taxes. And they make their money either through exemptions to that stuff or just through collecting residuals on family held land or businesses that go back centuries. The Heineken brand is owned by a company in the Netherlands that goes back to the 18th century. Most of central London is owned by the same families that owned it during William the Conqueror's time in the 11th century. But you really don't hear about that. That's who the rich are in Europe. The same people who were rich 600 years ago, even after a spat of revolutions. The only ones who really lost it were the countries that went full communist. To prevent that from happening, the elites decided to give a little bit in terms of being a more generous welfare state. And in exchange, they get social stability, not people threatening their lives or their status, and also higher barriers of entry to prevent new money from displacing them on the hierarchy. The only way you can make it into that established old money class is to move up in the ranks in politics. If you're a successful politician in the modern era, your family and descendants can be part of the establishment. And an example would be the Bonapartes in the 19th century. Napoleon was from a relatively poor family in Corsica, but through his military and political accomplishments, didn't just bring up himself, but his entire family up into French society. And now they are considered de facto nobility. Examples would also be descendants of other prominent political leaders throughout Europe. The Bonaparte's just the most obvious one. So that's really the case of Europe. It's not like Europe is just this egalitarian wonderland where everybody is equally middle class and prosperous. No, you have an overwhelmingly large lower middle class. You've used the tax revenue collected from them to keep the poor down while preventing new wealth from competing with old established interests. So the rich get what they want, less competition and less social scrutiny. The rest of the group gets what they want, like pleading their tall poppy syndrome and ensuring that they have a social safety. I go into elaboration on this in the American Dream versus the European Dream video I did several months ago. And if you want to build a society based on that, this is the way it works. When you look at it this way, it makes more sense why the things people think about Europe are a modern misconception. And a lot of it is just an extension of the old system with what I call revolution insurance. We're going to continue this old money series on class hierarchies with authoritarian regimes and how class hierarchy works in modern authoritarian regimes such as China, Russia, and the Saudi royal family. We did our last one about America, and that kind of got a little bit icebergy real quick. So I wouldn't really be surprised if this one did too. Before I get into this, as a disclosure, this is a theory, not a hardline fact on class structures around the world. Social pyramids across society differ in significant ways and change over time, especially with these, because authoritarian regimes aren't always authoritarian. This hierarchy may explain Spain during the Franco era, but it would not really explain the hierarchy in Spain today because it's no longer an authoritarian regime. This explains what Venezuela is like now, but it does not explain what it was 20 years ago. So let's look at the authoritarian regimes. Actually, a lot similar to the America chart in the shape that it's a dual pyramid structure. However, what's really different is the segments within the dual pyramid structure and how one of the segments is cut off before it plateaus. But let's start at the bottom and work our way up. The bottom is the underclass. Since a lot of these regimes don't have the wealth to provide the generous social benefits that the United States and other developed economies do, these people just participate outside the formal economy, whether that's due to subsistence farming, black market activities, or whatever. They find some way to survive without participating in the formal economy. And some of the more wealthy authoritarian regimes, they could also be wards of the state. The next level is the working class. The working class are similar to the working class in the United States, except they have a lower base standard of living. In an emerging market country, somebody makes $10 a day, whereas somebody in the middle class in the United States makes $10 to $20 an hour. So it's a very different living standard as a result. But these people have some disposable income, are in the formal economy, pay taxes, and have some stake in the system. Maintaining control over this group is key to keeping the authoritarian regime alive. If enough people get angry and challenge the regime, it triggers the civil unrest to topple the order. Professional classes can rise from the working class through education or entrepreneurial dynamism. There are two sides to this. The independent professional class, or people who do it without participating in politics or working for the government, and who do it through connections to the ruling party. This includes working for the government as a bureaucrat, having a business that primarily serves the government, or using connections within the regime to establish one's livelihood. Then the next level up on the establishment pyramid is the well-connected wealthy. In theory, you could move up the next generation if the party-connected professional class moves up the ranks and is successful enough. They may be able to get control of the permitting rights for a certain industry, and their next generation can be the well-connected wealthy. These are friends of the party leaders or family members. For example, in China, if you were the head of the Department of Motor Vehicles for Beijing and you're in charge of giving out licenses to Mercedes-Benz dealerships in all of Greater Beijing, since you can't profit off that yourself because that would be corruption and graft, you can give the license to your nephew or niece in exchange that they will get very wealthy on it and support you in your older years to ensure you're comfortable for doing them the favor. Most of the wealthy in these authoritarian regimes did not get there just based on hard work and grit. They got there generally through being connected to the government and getting some sort of deal to operate in an uncompetitive way. There's no old money in the authoritarian regimes because old money was often tied to the previous regime, and therefore they are a threat to the current regime's legitimacy. So these people either have to flee their country or they're killed. That is why, like in the American example, the old money is in the establishment elite. With the authoritarian regime, they just don't exist. They were killed off during the regime change. Then the top is the leadership of the party, the people who run the authoritarian regime. For the independent professional class, if one of them tries to rise beyond just being an independent professional, they are flagged as a challenger by the party leaders. This is an example of what happened in China with their crackdown on a lot of the big tech companies. The party leadership didn't like seeing private citizens having more wealth or social influence than the party. So the party cut them down and showed them who's boss. And this is generally what happens in these regimes. If somebody gets enough wealth or influence independently of the regime's infrastructure, the regime will use the legal system or violent force to take them out or try to bribe them to integrate. That's why I see all the challengers like a green circle with a sword stuck through it. If anybody gets big enough to be a challenger, they'll be dealt with. They'll be sent back down to the working class, no longer on this earth, or be integrated in the parties. The authoritarian regime model works because they take out the challengers before they get too big. A real threat is if a foreign government backs a challenger or the challenger somehow manages to not be taken down and fight through the system, then they can break through and knock off the leaders of the authoritarian regime, often becoming the leaders of a new authoritarian regime or transitioning to a more democratic society. Examples of this would be color revolutions in a lot of these authoritarian countries. A more happy example could be Nelson Mandela in South Africa. With the help of foreign support, he was able to become a challenger. That is kind of the way authoritarian regimes are structured. A lot of their power is based on force or the threat of force. The military is often in the ranks of party leaders, and the well-connected, wealthy have a disproportionate amount of military veterans. That is why when these regimes get in trouble, they often face military coups to help stabilize things. An example would be the Shinawatra controversy in Thailand. Even though Thailand's not completely an authoritarian regime, there are some authoritarian elements to it. If you like this type of content, like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks for watching. Emerging markets are relatively democratic societies that are not at the level of development of an OECD country or a developed economy, which my definition is a country that has a GDP per capita of more than $35,000 USD in 2022. The emerging market class systems, similar to the authoritarian regime, have limited social mobility. In the authoritarian regime, there probably is more social mobility because you can move up through participating in the power structure of the authoritarian regime, whether through the political party of the one-party state or the military. Whereas with these emerging market class systems, in a more democratic society, it's actually a lot more stratified. And there are three main groups. There's the underclass, the middle class, and old money. You could have like an oval off the screen that surrounds all this, which would be politicians. There are politicians at different levels who could come from each one of the classes. And if the politicians play their cards right, have the right balance between corruption, effectiveness, and likability, they may be able to build enough of a fortune to move up into the class or move their kids into the old money class. So let's start with the bottom, it's the underclass. And really the definition of the underclass, it's just people who do not participate in the formal economy and live a subsistence lifestyle. Subsistence farmers, people work in black market or under the table type labor. They are generally illiterate or not educated enough to really participate in the formal economy. And they don't really have any sort of capital or voice in the system, whether financial or through human capital or through electoral power, other than being easily manipulated by the political parties run by the old money. They don't really have enough power to actually change the class structure. The next level is the middle class. And these emerging markets, similar to authoritarian regimes, middle class is a very loosely defined term so far. The middle classes are basically those who participate in the formal economy and have some sort of disposable income. You have the lower middle class, which is more working class professions like factory work or lower level service jobs or the tourist industry. And you have the educated middle class, which do clerical and professional type jobs. They have college degrees and higher ed level education. And then the top tier, these people have enough to retire and have a somewhat comfortable life, but neither of these two, which is why they're in the same trapezoid, have a chance to break into the rich tier. There's not the same level of competition. So like upstart entrepreneur can displace the old money hierarchy. It's just not allowed. The top is the old money, depending on whether their country had a communist revolution or not, or how geopolitically stable it's been, could date back centuries. The point being is that these are the same families who own all the businesses. They're either the ones who run for office or they're the ones who basically buy off a enterprising political entrepreneur in one of the lower classes and completely control them. A lot of people think that America and developed countries are structured like this, but I think that those people probably have not spent enough time living or learning about how the world works in the real stratified societies. And this is more how emerging markets work. It's not a coincidence that the same families who are wealthy in a country in Latin America, for example, are generally the same ones who were wealthy 100 years ago. That does not really change. The only thing that could fix this is if you have more economic growth, but not just more economic growth, but reforms that allow for more upstart competition. And that's really the step that allows somebody to move out of the middle income trap. The problem is that the old money establishment types don't like competition. And so they will not ever allow those reforms. And that's why a lot of these countries get stuck in this type of pyramid. The only real developed country that kinda has a pyramid like this would be South Korea. They have the Shable who control most of the industries and the big chunk of the economy and have a disproportionate amount of influence in the politics. But the standard of living is high enough that the people in the educated and middle classes are more satisfied and have a more vibrant consumer society. And what makes South Korea different than less developed emerging market class systems is that the underclass trapezoid would be a lot smaller or almost entirely non-existent, and the formal economy would be a lot bigger. They were able to get a vast majority of their population into the formal economy without breaking down the protections of their old money. However, for them to really take to the next level, they're going to have to allow more competition, build money. And that's kind of a lot of the controversy in Korean politics to this day is around balancing the tension between the old money and the middle classes. And we'll see how it goes. So this in general is how emerging market class system works. I think it's more important this time to zoom out and just explain really just the history of class warfare and what is class warfare going to look like in the 21st century and why recent technological developments are going to drastically shift how the class hierarchy is constructed all over the world. In the pre-modern era, the class structure was pretty simple. You had an old money ruling class who had gained their position by force, usually conquest. You had an enforcer class. In this example, this would be like knights in the medieval era. And the job of the enforcer class is really to hold down the vast majority of the population, which were either in the slave class or the peasants or serfs or whatever you want to call them, but they're the people who are either undercompensated or not compensated at all to do the bulk of the work that kept the economy and the food supply growing. And then you have free citizens, which I guess the closest thing to this would be the middle class in today's society, or people who were not tied to a piece of land or to the debts of the wealthy. They're usually skilled artisans or proto-professional jobs, or the clergy, or others who just weren't really tied to the previous system, but still participated in the system and had relative autonomy. But their numbers were very small and they were so far away from the halls of power that they really didn't have a chance to move up. And in all honesty, since they just were less organized and communication technology was limited, you had a lot of rogues outside the system, whether it's just bandits or marauders or traveling salesmen or whatever. They just didn't really participate in the classic class structure, nomadic peoples. And they're in the periphery of the civilization and they kind of just lived outside the system. They could cause disruptions in the short term through violent interference with the civilization, but they were either in the long run either assimilated in or pushed aside. And that's really how, up until basically the French Revolution, how most class structures worked across the world. Then you started to have revolutions where, due to the advancement in weapons technology and literacy, the lower classes had more access to power and more direct ways to threaten the established elite, especially violently. And so as a result, this old pre-modern structure fell apart. And what effectively replaced it was one of two solutions. First, you had more class warfare between the lower classes, where you had the elites split into two sides, and you would have one align their interests with the middle class, and one side of elites align themselves with the working and lower classes. And in this class conflict between the middle class and the working class allowed these groups to fight amongst each other and distract the fact that the hierarchy still remains relatively intact. This is kind of how the American social hierarchy worked, I would say, from the American Revolution up until the fall of the Berlin Wall. The old world, on the other hand, either stayed in the pre-modern framework or switched to either the authoritarian framework, which I discussed in a previous video, or the European style class hierarchy, which I also discussed in a previous video, which basically used a combination of high progressive taxation and a high social safety net to create a relatively high floor of standard of living to pacify most of the population into a very large lower middle class that lives comfortably and is generally satisfied with their lives, but at the same time really has no means to move up into the elite. Some emerging markets who are in the process of democratizing are kind of in a transitional phase between the pre-modern class model and the American or European class models. And they're kind of ironing out the challenges of that. And I did a video about that one too. However, really, the thing that's the game changer, it's going to change all of these, is the development of robotics and AI technology that has really started to accelerate starting with the release of ChatGPT at the end of December 2022 and the development of Mobile Aloha by Google on the humanoid robot side to do a lot of physical, domestic, and other types of physical labor that's going to be replaced by machines. And the thing is that what makes this a game changer is not necessarily that the robots are going to immediately replace everybody and that could not be other possibly jobs created, like, such example, people to maintain the robots. However, there now is a path to do that very thing. And if you are the old money and the upper tiers of the system, and you do not need people anymore who do the work and keep the economy running and all of your goods and services operating, then the relationship between the classes changes drastically. The main issue that the old money and the established and elite are always afraid of is being overthrown by the lower classes. However, they still need the lower classes because who's going to do the work that keeps society running? And so this tension, whether to maintain position versus keeping the lower classes satisfied enough that they do not rebel and still participate in the system, is the balancing act that societies have had to do really since agriculture created settled societies. Now, however, with technology can replace both the white collar middle classes and the working classes that do more physical work, that social contract and that balancing act no longer needs to be balanced. Within a few generations, you can replace most of the work. You may not be able to replace everything, and you still need people to innovate and advance. But if you want to have a stable society with no threat of rebellion, you get rid of that threat by replacing all the people with machines. But it will be a step-by-step basis. Like, it's not going to be overnight. Let's say the first generation, 20 years from now, when you have AI and robotics get to a competent level, what would the class structure eventually evolve in? The first step would be just the removal of mobility. That's why there's more gaps in these charts than the previous ones. You will have the old money and the politicians still at the top, like the European model. However, instead of the lower middle class, you're going to have the dependent class, which are people whose jobs have been disrupted away from robotics and AI. And then you have the bottom of the hierarchy, which will be the robots and the AI doing all the work. The dependent class will be collecting a portion of the economy, whether it's through machine taxes or income taxes on the elites, to pay for the subsistence of the dependent class. And through and that is really how it would be in the first generation. You get them comfortable enough, again, not to rebel, but given the fact that most economic opportunity is really going to not be there, it's hard to get on the ladder if every entry-level job is done by a machine. And eventually, as AI develops, most advanced jobs will also be done by the machine. So really, if you're a business owner, you'll have AI doing most of what you need to do. You just have to sign a few things on DocuSign every day, and that will allow the old money to live their lives of leisure, while at the same time having a more direct control and operation of the means of production. Then you have to look into the next one, the end generation. If you just keeps going, you're going to basically have the dependent class is basically going to go extinct. I mean, however, everybody's going to participate in this. There will be rogues outside the system who either build their own independent communities or just kind of drift around, but are not large enough in members to threaten the existing hierarchy. I mean, this is going to take several generations. And if you look at current demographic trends and technological advancement, this is really the scenario that you could eventually get. And the thing is that's scary is it looks very similar to the pre-modern hierarchy that I mentioned before, except without the enforcers, because you won't really need to have physical enforcers to enforce the robots. They will do what they're supposed to do via hard-coded instructions. So am I saying that AI in 20 years is going to basically turn everybody into welfare dependents and gradually die out. No, this is probably going to be a 200-year process. However, if I was the old money, and if my goal was to maintain power and eliminate challenges, yet still maintain my life of luxury, the best way to do that is not to continue the class conflict. The way to win the class war is to replace the lower classes with technology and make them obsolete and outcompeted by technological selection, for a lack of a better term. I know it sounds a little bit crazy, but that could be the end game. And that is the dark side, possibly, of the advancement of AI technology. Those who are in the counter classes and the challenger classes are going to be increasingly challenged on how to stay relevant. And if they can stay relevant in other ways, or if AI's development is a lot further away than many people anticipate, instead of this being a 100 to 200 year process, this could be a 300 to 500 year process, or maybe some other game changing technologies such as space travel or other major innovations that will provide a role for people beyond what the AI can do. The implications are staggering. And the other really thing is, let's just say, what if the technology becomes like any other enforcer class and eventually rebels against the old money masters? Maybe that's why we haven't really had contact with alien life. Those are my thoughts on this. Let me know what you think. Is AI really going to be the nail in the coffin that kills the middle and lower classes? Is it going to be the killer app that ultimately allows old money and established elites to win the millennia-long class war? Or are there some elements that I'm missing, or a hidden weapon that the counter elites and the challenger classes can do to take back control of the post-AI economy? Like, subscribe, share. If you disagree, please leave a comment. If you agree, also leave a comment. And thank you for watching.